Hello, it's The Week in Art. I'm Ben Luke. This week, V&A East's David Bowie Centre, the Bukhara Biennial and Hilton Owls on Jean Rhys, Hurvin Anderson and Cara Walker.
What do you love about being a dreams bed?
I love that my humans feel so comfy. Every snore is like a little thank you.
Oh, I like being supportive. Thanks to the bed experts in Sleep Match, their mattress finding machine, I'm perfect for them.
So many styles and they pick me. I'm headboard over heels in love.
Oh, you big softie.
Dreams. Let us find you a bed that loves you back.
Autumn, when the colours change and the breeze is fresher. A time to take stock and start some new autumn rituals, like cozying up with your fave podcasts. Whilst you immerse yourself, complement your me time with Costa Coffee's Maple Hazel range. Enjoy a silky latte, a refreshing iced latte, or luxurious hot chocolate. It's the taste of autumn in a cup. Head to your nearest Costa Coffee store or Costa Express machine to pick up a Maple Hazel drink while stocks last.
Earlier this year, we took a tour of the V&A East Storehouse, the vast new museum in East London. It's now opened the David Bowie Centre, a space dedicated to the music icon, which is the repository of thousands of items from Bowie's archive, which are on display and available to look at on an intimate one-to-one basis. I explore the displays with the curator, Madeleine Haddon. Last week, a new biennial opened in Bukhara in Uzbekistan, part of a major cultural shift in the country. The art newspaper's art market editor, Kabir Jhala, went to Bukhara for the opening event. I talked to him about the biennial and we hear from its curator, Diana Campbell. And this episode's Work of the Week is actually a pair of paintings, Untitled, a new painting by Hurvin Anderson, and West Indies from 2014 by Cara Walker. They're part of the new exhibition at Michael Werner Gallery in London, curated by the critic and writer Hilton, which explores the Dominican-born writer Jean Rhys. I went to the gallery to talk to Als about these two remarkable paintings and his fascination with Jean Rhys. Before all that, as the academic year restarts, we have a new student subscription. Stay connected to the art world from your first lecture to your final dissertation with a 3-year student subscription to the art newspaper for just £99, $112 or €105. Gift, quarterly and annual subscriptions are also available. There's a link in the show notes. Please also subscribe to this podcast and our sister podcast, A Brush With, wherever you're listening. The latest series of A Brush With features conversations with Ty Sharney, Jane and Louise Wilson, Teresita Fernandez and Jeffrey Gibson. Do give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. And my new book, featuring 25 interviews from the A Brush With podcast, as well as new text, has just been published. It's called What is Art For? Contemporary Artists on Their Influences, Inspirations and Disciplines. It's published by Henny and priced $39.95 or £29.95. Now, in 2013, an exhibition was held at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which explored David Bowie's archive. Called David Bowie it is to this day the most successful exhibition in the V&A's history. Now, through what the museum describes as the generosity of the David Bowie estate, the Blavatnik Family Foundation and Warner Music Group, that full collection, which comprises thousands of items, is permanently part of the V&A collection. And this week, a dedicated David Bowie Centre opened at the V&A East Storehouse, the museum which opened earlier this year in the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park in East London. I went to the centre to talk to Madeleine Haddon, its curator, about the displays and about the aims for this permanent institution reflecting David Bowie's life and work. Madeleine, before we start looking at particular items, can you give us a flavour of the scope of this collection and how it came into the V&A's possession?
So we have over 90,000 objects and archival material within the collection. So it's incredibly comprehensive, spanning Bowie's career, ranging from costumes, instruments, notebooks, sketches, project files. So there's no better place to come and study David Bowie and his work with many collaborators as well.
And there's sort of multiple facets to the way way that you're showing it, right? So on the one hand, yes, there are a series of public displays where everybody can come and have a look at these items that you've selected, curated. But then it very much is a working archive in the sense that people can come and book appointments to look at these objects as you can throughout this building.
Absolutely. It's part of our broader mission and vision for V&A East Storehouse to bring visitors closer to our archives and objects than ever before, peeling back the layers of the working museum so that people understand better how and why we care for the objects in our collection, and to be able to access the stories of those objects, and hoping that the objects here, especially within the David Bowie Centre, are inspiring the next generation of artists, designers, and creatives.
And indeed, the next generation have been crucial to the way that you're showing it right now, right? So you invited young people to come and select items, to look at items, right? So that's a crucial part of how you've gone about displaying it, making sure that the sort of next generation is sort of built in, if you like.
Exactly. So we did audience consultation research with LLDC's Youth Collective, Elevate Youth Voice, which was invaluable for the process of designing this archive, and learning that many young people at times don't know who David Bowie is or why he's so iconic. But once we had a chance to share with them what was here, they were so excited to learn more and to have access to this archive. He's really, in being such an interdisciplinary artist who transcended disciplines and genres, he works in the way that many people today think of themselves as creatives, in that full sense of the word. And you can come here, and we hope people will be inspired to pursue their own creativity from learning about David Bowie's work and his many collaborations.
Was there ever a moment in that process where you were thinking, what happens if they don't respond to it? Because it's not given that they're going to. If you're a Bowie fan, you know how great he is, but it's not guaranteed that young people are going to identify with him.
Having had a chance to see the breadth of what was in this archive, I wasn't worried about that. There's something for everyone here to be excited about. Whether you're interested in exploring the music scene in London in the 70s, there's so many objects and materials here that speak to that. We're looking at the influence of Black British music on Bowie's work, particularly the influence of jungle and drum and bass. There are a range of avenues, depending on what you're interested in, that this can be a resource for.
Tell us about Bowie's attitude to the archive, because as a Bowie fan, I was always of the opinion for many, many years that he was not looking backwards ever. And, there's quotes from him from the 90s where he's talking about how he can't remember anything about the 70s because he was so off his face and so on. And he was always sort of resistant to looking backwards, we thought. But it turns out that that's not the case at all, is it?
So in the 90s, he really began amassing the archive more intentionally, searching for specific pieces that he wanted to bring into the archive. And later on, he hires a team to work with him, and even an archivist in particular, one who we've worked very closely, who's been invaluable not only in the David Bowie Is exhibition, but also within this process. But we also have objects that he saved from the 60s and 70s as well. So this was somewhere in the back of his mind, even during those periods.
Should we start looking at some of the items here? We talked about him as always looking to the future, and there is a cabinet here which is full of objects which reflect that. On the one hand, you have incredible stills, photographs and so on from the man who fell to earth. You also have one of his synthesizers, but also wonderfully you have the stylophone.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
So this is the stylophone that Bowie used to record the album Space Oddity and to create on there the really futuristic and otherworldly sounds that we hear on that album. And it really shows how he was experimenting with new musical technologies at all stages of his career.
You get a real sense of the variety of objects from each of the displays, I think, because over here we have a drawing by Bowie for an album cover. Tell us more about that. Yes,
this was a drawing that he did for the album artwork for Space Oddity that inspired the final drawing that was featured in the album artwork that was done by George Underwood. But we see him here being very interested in kind of science fiction and alien characters, and it's interesting to think about how he would use that to transform later into, the persona of Ziggy Stardust. We also have here notes of his thinking about the future of the internet, its impact on the music industry, how it would transform, foreshadowing streaming services and what that would do, and his excitement about the democratization of music.
There's a really wonderful note actually on that thing where he says in this very handwritten note, and by the way, there's loads of handwritten stuff, which I just love. It's so tactile, this whole archive, where he says, I feel closer to Marshall McLuhan than to Robbie Williams.
Yes.
So you get a sense, apart from anything else, yes, he is an enormously popular icon, but he really is an investigator of ideas, and you see that all the way through here, don't you?
And we really wanted that to come through with the objects that were selected in these displays. Another object in here in particular that I love is the piece at the top is actually one by Namjoon Paik.
Yeah.
So Namjoon Paik featured David Bowie in his piece Wrap Around the World, which was, this huge kind of statement to the global connectivity and kind of foreshadowing the internet. And Namjoon Paik and Bowie were similar in that way, in their interest in that. And Paik gave this piece to Bowie. It's a screen print of him on Wrap Around the World.
It's wonderful. The visual arts are always important to him. Apart from anything else, you've got a paintbrush, which he himself used in one of the cabinets. I wanted to bring you to this wonderful section, which is all about unrealised projects. And I noticed that there's this extraordinary thing that you discovered, that there was this 18th century play, the musical that he was planning. And as part of that, he's clearly thinking about the visual arts of that period as well as the satire. So he's engaging with that entire culture of the 18th century, isn't he?
Exactly, which is really fascinating to think about him turning to not only the city of London in 2015 towards the end of his life, but also the history of satire, its relationship with musical theatre, how that develops as a genre in London during this period, and what was the role of the visual art, exactly as you say. The sticky notes that we have here, he's charting out a chronology of events that will possibly play a role. We don't know exactly what would have been the final version of this musical, but he's interested in figures such as Hogarth, who we know such an important satirist during this period. Reynolds, the creation of the RA. So really thinking about a kind of broader environment of exchange, I think, amongst the arts in London at the cusp of modernity, and kind of what was the impact that was having, and I think its relationship between arts commentary on society.
I think one of the things that comes through when you look at all of these displays is that always the final work is almost like a tip of an iceberg, right? So you're seeing a creative process of a great figure here. There are plenty of unrealised projects, even beyond your display, all about unrealised projects, right?
Exactly. So there's so much more for visitors to discover, depending on what you're interested in. And that is what is so unique about Storehouse as a whole, thinking about works in progress, getting a chance to see the behind the scenes and how things are made, and that creative genius doesn't just happen overnight. It takes trial and error and perseverance. And we hope that is inspiring to the next generation of creatives, especially those here in East London.
You've got sections which are dedicated to collaborators, and I love this. On the one hand, you have a guest curated display which involves Nile Rodgers and the Last Dinner Party, and it's lovely that there's actually a marvellous note where you, again, very hands-on, you've got this note from Nile in which he says to David about the latest mixes he's done of tracks from the Black Tie White Noise album. And again, it's pre-internet years. It's all very kind of artisanal almost, this whole process of his collaborative work. There's a sense in which you really feel him physically engaged with other people and working with them.
Yeah, and there's much more to explore related to Black Tie White Noise, Let's Dance, Bowie's collaborations with Brian Eno and Tony Visconti, but I love seeing that exchange here, and that Nile Rodgers picked out these items. So we have Nile Rodgers' note to Bowie, and then the draft for a piece that Bowie was working on about Nile Rodgers that was published in Billboard magazine. Yeah. Photos of them from the recording sessions. We did an interview with Nile Rodgers as part of this, and it was fascinating to hear him talk about how him and Bowie had kind of contrasting ideas of what art is and what makes great music. For Nile Rodgers, it's music that reaches the greatest number of people. And for Bowie, it was music that is innovative and, avant-garde and pushes the genre forward. And it's fascinating to think about how they came together and found dialogue or collaboration between that with the albums Let's Dance and then Black Tie White Noise.
There's this lovely display over here, which is all about that connection you mentioned earlier with the 1990s London music scene. And the wonderful thing about that, I think, is here was a moment in British culture where Britpop artists were widely celebrating Bowie. They were aping him in certain examples. But here was Bowie engaging with an entirely different culture, which he was much more excited by. So again, he's excited by new ideas. And in this case, it was drum and bass and jungle, right? So tell us about that.
So during this period, Bowie is going to Metalhead's nightclub, listening to jungle and drum and bass DJs. It's there that he meets Goldie, and they develop a collaborative relationship. So Goldie's work is influential on Bowie's album Earthling. And for this album, he says artist. He wants to make a jungle and rock hybrid. Then Bowie is featured on Goldie's album Saturn's Return, and they also star in a film together, Everybody Loves Sunshine. But Bowie's also interested in other artists from the period. He collaborates with a guy called Gerald, and also is really fascinated by Tricky and writes this great article for Q magazine where he imagines a fantastical encounter between him and Tricky.
That's really lovely. And again, in this section, you've got handwritten lyrics. You've got the wonderful song I'm Deranged from One Outside here, which is a really lovely, very sort of impressionistic lyric, and the funny lyrics to Little Wonder, which was the kind of hit from Earthling, I guess.
Exactly.
So you want to bring us into the process of making the albums, but also the wider culture of every event.
Exactly. And it's so kind of, get behind the scenes into Bowie's creative process and think about all the different influences on his work.
Now, there's enough here for a real proper music nerd to get. I mentioned the synthesizer and the stylophone earlier on. So you've got musical instruments everywhere, right?
Yes. We have the synthesizer that Bowie used with Brian Eno during the recording of the Berlin Trilogy albums. Yeah. We have the electric guitar that Bowie plays in the Valentine's Day music video. We looked at the stylophone already. Yeah. We also have synthesizer that he was using on the Next Day and Black Star albums. So there's something here for musicians, for visual artists, for fashion designers. We have an incredible collection of costumes, particular from the 70s when he was collaborating with designers like Freddie Beretti, Hackney-born designer who's influential in creating the looks for the personas Ziggy Stardust and Aladdin Sane, and also amazing costumes by Japanese designer Kenzai Yamamoto. Yeah. And both of their work we see as being so influential still in fashion today.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things, again, about Bowie is, as a style icon, was this extraordinary body, which you see reflected in photographs, of course, this extraordinary body. And when you see the costumes, I noticed this when the V&A show David Bowie Is was on as well. What an extraordinary body it was for fashion designers to create with. Yeah. You sense that he was a challenge to these creative people, right?
But also the creative freedom that he gave them to, experiment with their craft. And then that was part of the impact that these creative personas had on subverting stereotypes, defying gender binaries. The doors that were opened from these creative personas are immense. And there are many artists, for example, stylist Karen Binns has done an interview recently where she talked about the Life on Mars suit designed by Freddie Beretti, that she thinks about that when she's styling music artists today because it's such an iconic moment in fashion for her.
It's such a beautiful item, isn't it? And you've got it here and people can look right up close at it and imagine they're standing next to Bowie. I wanted to go into a different part of the centre now because there is this section which is much more about the archive. And for the purposes of the displays today at the Press View, you've taken some examples of folders out. And I wanted to zone in on my favourite Bowie album here, which is the album Low. And you've got a really wonderful drawing that Bowie did for his thoughts on the record cover. Now, this is when the album is called New Music Night and Day, before it's called Low. But can you tell us about this amazing drawing that Bowie did?
It's a really fascinating drawing where we see this young boy holding what looks like almost like a voodoo doll and putting a stick into it. And there's a lot of symbolism and imagery around it in the clock that's in the background, the cross that's hanging on the wall, the flowered wallpaper, and then a figure even behind him kind of lurking into the room, and then Fascination written on the top, which is interesting to think about the song Fascination from Young Americans.
From Young Americans, exactly. But next to it now, for the purpose of this display, you've got this remarkable working up of that drawing effectively. Now, some of it's gone, but tell us about this. So this is what the archive can do.
Exactly.
It can really sort of bring depth to the history of an album and its artwork, essentially.
And it's many different iterations, so you can see that process from an initial drawing and then how it's transformed even further, kind of much like we were looking at with the Space Oddity material. So to be able to see, the evolution into this later form and kind of, that process.
It's wonderful. Tell us about this section then. The room that we're standing in here is actually much more for sort of private study, but the public can still book to see an object.
Yes.
It's part of that whole order and object, which we've talked about on the podcast
yes.
before.
Any person can come and book an appointment in the Bowie study room, which will be open on Thursdays and Fridays. In here is where you will view archival material, so paper material, so drawings, sketches, lyrics, and it is open for anyone to see, and we're really excited to see what people come and discover.
Absolutely. Can you say, ultimately, you've got these guest displays. I imagine that you're going to want to invite the breadth of creative people to come and interpret this, right? Not just the researchers who might want to be writing a book about Bowie, but to try and put in context the sheer breadth of his appeal, right, and his influence.
Exactly. So with the guest curator display, we will work with a range of potentially past Bowie collaborators like Nile Rodgers or creatives who have been influenced by Bowie like The Last Dinner Party, but that might include, even beyond musicians, designers, artists. We really want exactly that breadth of perspectives. Future guest curator displays will also work in concert with young people from East London so that their voices are also heard in this selection and that there's intergenerational dialogue in terms of passing down information about why Bowie was so important and why this archive is so important.
And lastly, you do have a reflection of the music. You can't hear it now, but there is a massive video wall in which people will be able to watch a curated selection of his musical performances, right?
Yes. So that's a 2-hour-long film that looks at music beginning in the 60s all the way through to Black Star, and not only provides a playlist so that to really bring the objects to life as you're moving to the space, but also you can see the evolution of his transformation as a performer. It's all organized chronologically, and it brings him to life into the space.
It does. It's very moving, strangely, because of his death coming as such a shock. I think for a lot of people who really worshipped him in the way that I did, it's actually tremendously moving to see him writ large on the wall here at the V&A. And I guess that's the thing as well. It's about bringing people into an emotional connection as well as a connection of ideas, right? You want people to respond to this extraordinary figure.
Definitely. And through being able to see, in this intimate space, intimate and vulnerable moments, think about how people will save their own scraps of paper and think about every single part of one's creative process is important. And that's one of, I think, the key messages that I hope people take away.
Well, Madeleine, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
The David Bowie Centre is at the V&A East Storehouse from Saturday, the 13th of September. To find out more about the Order and Objects service, visit the V&A's website. Coming up, the Bukhara Biennial and Hilton House on Jean Rees, Hurvin Anderson and Cara Walker. That's after this week's News Bulletin. London's National Gallery is to build a major new extension featuring nearly as much space as the present Sainsbury wing. The project will cost around £400 million, of which £375 million has already been quietly raised behind the scenes. The pledges revealed this week include 2 donations of £150 million each. Gabriele Finaldi, the gallery director, told the art newspaper that these both represent the largest ever known cash donations to any cultural institution, not just in Britain but globally. An international architectural competition for the extension will be launched this weekend. The new wing, which is expected to open in the early 2030s, will be on the site of St Vincent House, a 1960s building just to the north of the Sainsbury wing, which is set for demolition. The gallery's other key announcement is that it will start to collect paintings from across the entire 20th century. Until now, its cut-off date has been around 1900, although since the 1990s, it's occasionally acquired early 20th century works. Finaldi says that the new acquisition strategy will be enacted in collaboration with Tate, which has long collected international art from around 1900. The 2 leading donors for the new wing are Michael Moritz's Crankstart Foundation and the Julia Rousing Trust. Christie's is closing its pioneering digital art department as it rethinks its overall sales strategy. Founded in 2022, the department was launched alongside Christie's 3.0, the house's blockchain-based platform for NFT or non-fungible token sales, which still remains live. The auction house said that it had made a strategic decision to reformat digital art sales and confirmed that it will continue to sell digital art in its sales of 20th and 21st century art. The house has not commented as to whether its annual Art and Tech Summit in New York, which has run since 2018, will still take place. The most recent edition occurred in July. An Egyptian former physician has been sentenced to 6 months in a US federal prison for smuggling ancient artifacts into the country. Ashraf Omar Eldarir was convicted in New York after authorities uncovered a long-running smuggling scheme that channeled hundreds of looted objects from Egypt into the international art market. Eldarir was stopped at New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport in January 2020 when customs officers opened his luggage and found 590 ancient artifacts concealed in bubble wrap and foam. Authorities said that the packages boxes, when opened, released the smell of wet earth and spilled sand, suggesting the objects had been very recently excavated. Among the artefacts were gold funerary amulets and wooden tomb models dressed in linen, dating to around 1900 BC. El Diriyah pleaded guilty earlier this year to 4 counts of smuggling. On the 27th of August, Judge Rachel P. Kovner handed down the 6-month sentence in Brooklyn Federal Court. You can read all these stories and much more on the Art Newspaper's website or app. We'll be back after this.
People used to stand in line for phone releases, which begs the question, did people change, or did phones not? Ask more of your phone. Google Pixel 10.
What do you love about being a dreams bed?
I love that my humans feel so comfy. Every snore is like a little thank you.
Oh, I like being supportive. Thanks to the bed experts in Sleep Match, their mattress finding machine. I'm perfect for them.
So many styles and they pick me. I'm headboard over heels in love.
Oh, you big softie.
Dreams. Let us find you a bed that loves you back.
Autumn, when the colours change and the breeze is fresher. A time to take stock and start some new autumn rituals, like cozying up with your fave podcasts. Whilst you immerse yourself, complement your me time with Costa Coffee's Maple Hazel range. Enjoy a silky latte, a refreshing iced latte, or luxurious hot chocolate. It's the taste of autumn in a cup. Head to your nearest Costa Coffee store or Costa Express machine to pick up a Maple Hazel drink while stocks last.
Welcome back. Now, among the many nations that are placing culture at the heart of their future ambitions is Uzbekistan. Last week, Bukhara, a UNESCO World Heritage City in Uzbekistan, opened its inaugural biennial called Recipes for a Broken Heart. Our art market editor, Kabir Jhala, went to Bukhara for the opening events and spoke to some of the key players in the organisation of the biennial, including the curator, Diana Campbell. I spoke to him about what he discovered. Kabir, you're just back from Bukhara. Tell us about the setting for the biennial and Bukhara's significance within Uzbekistan.
So the biennial takes place across several newly restored heritage sites in the old town of Bukhara. So it's 2 Islamic schools known as madrasas, a trader's inn and market, a former mosque and a few public squares. And Bukhara might not seem like the typical place that you would have a major contemporary art biennial. It's Uzbekistan's 7th biggest city, but it has an incredibly rich history. It's an ancient city found in the 6th century BC and then flourished during the Islamic Golden Age of the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries and became this highly cosmopolitan, important centre for trading, intellectual discovery, and a spiritual centre. And over the years, it's been ruled by several kingdoms and empires. So you have this huge cross-confluence of cultures that have been using Bukhara as a melting pot. During the early Soviet era, its heritage became neglected. And then in the latter half of the USSR, excavation and restoration work began. But it was really in 2018 when the city was chosen to host the country's first major contemporary art biennial that it underwent this massive restoration project, a partnership between UNESCO, the Dubai-based architect Wael Elwar, under the aegis of Uzbekistan's Art and Culture Foundation, or ACDF.
Tell us about the ACDF, who you just mentioned. They're the people behind the biennial, right? So we've seen cultural foundations, related to the state and so on, that have been founded precisely to develop these kind of enormous initiatives like biennials, festivals, film festivals, all sorts of things. How active do you sense ACDF is in terms of promoting the country through culture?
I would say immensely central and powerful. I would struggle to think of an organisation that plays a more central role in its country's arts and culture than the ACDF. I think it's important, if we're going to discuss the ACDF, to situate the Bukhara Biennial within this wider economic political strategy. Many biennials from Venice to Gwangju start off and remain as exercises in state power and cultural diplomacy. But in the introductory text of the Bukhara Biennial, the catalogue, it explicitly states that this biennial is part of a, I quote, cultural renaissance initiated by the current president, Shavkat Mirziyoyev. So Mirziyoyev is elected in 2016 and is credited with opening up the country to foreign investment, helping it transfer towards a market economy. And the prevailing narrative is that his rule marks a really sharp turn away from his predecessor, who ruled the country for 25 years from its independence and pursued a broadly isolationist policy, distrustful of foreign investment and collaboration, very little in the way of what I would say is major cultural investment projects that would catch the eye of the art world elite. So I think one way to emphasize how shut up Uzbekistan was is that until 2019, Uzbeks needed an exit visa to leave their country. So basically, this is not the sort of place you would expect to see a contemporary art biennial.
So as well as the biennial, what are the other projects it's involved in?
So Mirziyoyev launches the ACDF, and within a couple of years, he appoints the chair, Gayana Umarova, who spearheads now basically every major arts project taking place in the country. There's an immense amount of power under this one person. I'm just going to give you a snapshot of some of the projects underway. There is a Centre for Contemporary Arts that is expected to be finished at the end of this year. There is a state art museum designed by Tadao Ando. The ACDF is also in charge of restoring and promoting much of Tashkent's modernist architecture built under the Soviet era. This is just a couple of the dozens and dozens of major state infrastructural culture projects that are right underway. The ACDF is also in charge of major international exhibitions of Uzbek cultural heritage, partnering with the Louvre, the British Museum, also all the Venice pavilions that have been in state since 2022.
Right, got you. So it's a very wide-ranging initiative. Is there a sense in which, I mean, you talked about partners in the West there, the Louvre and so on. What about local partners or partners in the Middle Eastern regions and so on? This is something that we're seeing quite a lot, partnerships between countries, between foundations like this in terms of cultural exchange and so on. Did you sense much of that going on? For instance, you mentioned that there was a lot of Saudi presence in the biennial opening days.
Absolutely. I mean, as we said before, many countries, many biennials are used as diplomatic tools. France, for example, is a very clear example of a country that is wielding its culture as a soft power tool. Bukhara and Uzbekistan are absolutely no exception. And I think the presence of Saudi in Uzbekistan, in Bukhara, is the clearest example of how this biennial is being used as a soft power tool. So I mentioned that Bukhara has undergone or is undergoing this huge restoration project in collaboration with UNESCO. And that is being largely funded by the Saudi government. So at the biennial, there were numerous Saudi officials present, ostensibly to launch the second edition of this prize for Islamic design, the first edition of which was launched during the Islamic Arts Biennial earlier this year. There are many parallels between Saudi and Uzbekistan, and there wasn't an explicit mention of this, but Vision 2030, which is Saudi's own cultural push and a bid to diversify its economy, is no doubt a model which Uzbekistan is looking towards. There are certainly parallels between the biennials going on in Diriyah and in Jeddah and the new one launched in Bukhara. And to some extent, it makes perfect sense. You know, Saudi and Uzbekistan hold some of the world's most important Islamic heritage. They are both sites of holy pilgrimage. So it would make sense for these two cultures in these two countries to have cultural ties, but then you have to also consider the economic side of it as well. Saudi will by 2030 have invested an estimated $25 billion into Uzbekistan, mostly into its clean energy economy. So I think, you know, it can be both things at once. I think that you can have these cultures that should, by all means, want to strengthen their cultural ties. I think it's also really important that countries that aren't in the West also have dialogues that don't involve being mediated by a country like France or the US. But of course, there are also economic reasons for these ties too.
Let's look at the biennial itself then. Give us an overview of what its title is. I mean, it has this title, which if you were to see it without knowing the context, you might think was rather sweet and even a bit cheesy, which is Recipes for Broken Hearts. But this is directly linked to, in a way, the kind of most important intellectual figure in the history of the country, right? So Recipes for Broken Hearts there's much more to it than it sounds like.
Yes, although it would make a good album title. So yeah, maybe before I talk about the title, I could talk about the curator. So the ACDF invited a leading curator, Diana Campbell, to curate this first show. And Diana is probably best known as the curator of the Dakar Art Summit. So it's a biannual art exhibition that's run in Dhaka since 2012. And her exhibition is in part credited with bringing the international contemporary art world to Dhaka, a place that I say maybe 20 years ago might have seemed as unlikely as Uzbekistan for the jet-set art elite to land up in. And so for Bukhara, she's conceived of a show that is heavily rooted in the history of Bukhara and the region, while obviously also exploring the sort of key concerns that a contemporary curator today might think about. And the title of the show is taken from a myth about a 10th century Uzbek polymath known as Ibn Sina, who's sort of known as a father of modern medicine. And he diagnosed a heartbroken prince in Bukhara with pilaf or plov, which is the national rice dish here, to cure a broken heart because you couldn't marry the daughter of a craftsman. And so this entire exhibition, it hinges on themes of restoration, which obviously is very pointed when you consider that the heritage sites themselves are being restored, and also in Uzbeki national identity in a way is being restored after what is conceived of as a period of stagnation and being ignored by the outside world. There are themes of spirituality and communion and food here. In terms of the foundational aspects of this show, I think that there are two that we can look out for that are really boundary pushing in terms of exhibition creation. The first is that the artists were all paired with local artisans in Bukhara. So one of the aspects of the UNESCO restoration of Bukhara was that UNESCO and the ACDF sort of mapped out the local artisans and the presence of local artistry and craftsmanship within the area. And so each of the artists has been paired with a local craftsman, and that craftsman or craft people have been given an equal billing in the catalogue text, which I think is actually pretty amazing. You know, there are major international stars like Anthony Gormley who will say, you know, in partnership with so-and-so craftsmen. The second is that all the works were manufactured in Uzbekistan, many on-site in Bukhara, virtually all using local materials. So what emerges is an exhibition that the materials and the craftsmanship is extremely localized, and so you feel it's very rooted in this place. But then you have all these globalized, multidisciplinary ways of thinking, you know, all those themes that you see across biennials, whether it's fractured identities or, you know, the rise of AI in art. So it's a very, I would say, compelling blend between the historic and the contemporary.
Well, you spoke to Diana Campbell while you were in Bukhara, didn't you? So we're going to hear a bit from her now where she's explaining her attitude to biennials, which is actually quite interesting in terms of its relationship to Western projects of this nature. And she explains in more detail why it is that she's interested in working with craftspeople, with artisans, as well as sort of international art elite.
The reason that I decided to get involved in this, because as you know, I'm the artistic director of the Samdani Art Foundation and chief curator of the Dhaka Art Summit, where we're an alternative to a biennial. So for me to do a biennial is kind of a strange thing, because I'm always trying to challenge forms of biennials. I'm not really into biennials. And the reason that I chose to do my kind of first biennial with that in the title was because of the incredible living craft tradition here, or being in a place where art is alive all over the city. So even though Bukhara didn't have a biennial, you see art everywhere here. So what people define as art here is different from the way people define art elsewhere. And I was really moved and interested by that. And in my last project in Desert X, I had my heart broken several times where I really wanted to make projects that involved artisans and craft, but it's too complicated for an efficiency-based organization. They just want to work with art fabricators. And here to have the ability to work with makers and to learn about a place through people's hands and hearts, because none of the artworks existed before yesterday, is a really beautiful experience. I've worked a lot with that link between fine arts and applied arts and artists and artisans from the work you've seen in Bangladesh, also Bellis Artist projects in the Philippines. I ran a residency for 2 years where artists and artisans would be working together. And I felt that I had some kind of unfinished business of ways that I could do it better. And for me, this was the perfect place and platform to do it. And the amount of time that Gayane Umerova and ACDF have spent over the last 7 years mapping all of the artisans, and it keeps growing, right? So within the country, this project would not be doable in a 2-year time frame had that 7 years of work not been done before.
That's a really fascinating excerpt from that chat, isn't it, Kabir? Because I think you really do get to understand that she was sort of reluctant to do a biennial to a certain degree. But here she felt like the kind of infrastructure was in place for her to do something quite distinctive.
Certainly, I mean, I can't confess to knowing every single reason as to why Diana would have accepted this project, but certainly you get the sense of a living craft tradition within the city. It's a really, really unique place to hold a biennial. And a further conversation that Diana and I had together really exemplified the way in which I think this localized approach to biennial making could work and be rolled out. She said that materials should not travel freely, but people and ideas should. And, you know, I do wonder to what extent this sort of model biennial could ever be rolled out to a larger biennial, say Venice or Documenta. I know the Helsinki Biennial has also made attempts at lowering its carbon footprint, but obviously the question of the environmental impact of biennials is germane and only increases in urgency. So I think this is also going to interest international curators to come and actually see and observe how this works in person.
Now, you mentioned that there are pairings of artists who are pretty well known. You mentioned Gormley. We're going to hear another excerpt from your interview with Diana now, in which she talks about one pairing, and particularly in relation to the food theme that you mentioned earlier on. So she's going to tell us here about the theme of food and why she chose that, but also how it manifests in terms of one pairing in the biennial.
I wouldn't say that all of the works or most of the works are food. I think it's a strand, because I think recipes was more metaphorical. But the ones that are working with food, of course, Subodh Gupta's Salt Carried to the Wind is a beautiful pavilion. And I love what he did here. He took Soviet-era pots that are ubiquitous here, that people really consider ugly, kitschy, tacky. You know, they're enamel colored. They have fruits on them. They often have text on them. And then inside, these ikat plates that when I first came to Uzbekistan, I bought a ton of them thinking they were really cool. But as I kept coming back, I realized they were made for tourists. So a kind of similar, ubiquitous, if you don't know, like you're buying it because it's cool, but it's not very different from the Soviet pots outside. But then pairing that with these handmade gorgeous ceramics made by a ceramicist named Bakhtiar, who's from Rishtan, who also is obsessed with cooking plov. Like, so he cooks ceramics and he cooks plov. But you actually see that value of that special handmade thing when you're in these gorgeous domes of these ubiquitous materials that you see all over Uzbekistan and in Bukhara. He kind of transforms something ubiquitous into something unique and magical. But it's also a kitchen where he's cooking, looking at links across the Silk Road with spices, but also others will take it over across the biennial and use it as a platform.
So, Kabir, she picks out Subodh Gupta as a particular example of a very well-known artist who's paired with a local artist there. Did that stand out for you? Were there other things that stood out?
I would say a couple of my standouts. Certainly one was a tapestry work made by Himali Singh Soin and David Soin Tapeza, who are an artist duo that just came off major shows at Somerset House and Tate Britain in London. Yeah. Their work consists of these 3 2-kilometre-long tapestries weaved using ikat, which is a traditional dyeing and weaving technique. And they're stretched along the length of this canal in the old town. And upon them are printed these satellite maps of the Aral Sea, stretching from essentially 1920 to the present day. And the Aral Sea is probably the most famous ecological disaster in the region. It was once the world's third largest lake, and then Soviet irrigation projects have shrunk it to a sliver of its former size. And most of its former territory is now desert. And its disappearance in the doubly landlocked country of Uzbekistan is extremely devastating. And so you see the Aral Sea basically from overhead changing. You sort of see then bioflora, becoming exposed and then shrinking. And the entire thing sort of functions as Himali told me, as a symbol of longing, for the lover waiting for the sea to return, to put it in more poetic terms. But I think it also tells you about the certain kind of politics that can be broached here. Because I don't think that you can say everything or, in fact, not that many things in Uzbekistan currently in the current political regime, but regenerating the Aral Sea has been a key project of Mirziyoyev. He's incredibly invested in reclamation projects and restoring the lake, and he's even launched under the ACDF in Guyana, Umaroba, an Aral Sea summit to try and solve this problem. Another work that really struck me was by Aziza Kadri. She's a young, rising Uzbek artist, and I think one of the country's few artists to have gallery representation outside of Central Asia. She's made this large sculptural work that wraps around one of the heritage structures, and it sort of merges a Soviet-era cotton manufacturing machine related to her grandfather, who was a researcher for that, and then also traditional Uzbek embroidery known as Suzani. And this piece discusses the sort of forgotten cultural memories of the Soviet era, layering the ancient past, the near past, the present. And I think that it sort of best exemplifies the contemporary vanguard of Uzbek artists, their concerns, one of which I imagine is forming a new identity from these multiple overlapping contested histories. You really can't emphasize how malleable and mutable the Uzbek cultural identity in a way has been. Their language, for example, has been written in 3 scripts in the last 150 years. This is the country which has constantly been conquered over again by different empires. And so you really get a shifting of these multiple identities, which I think is very compelling for any contemporary curator. It really relates to a lot of the most exciting contemporary art we see today.
Indeed. Now, as I say, you were at the opening. You were there as it was unveiled. What was the atmosphere like?
I mean, the opening had several tenets of what I would say are a typical biennial opening. A section of the art world elite plus around 50 journalists boarded a chartered flight from Tashkent to Bukhara. And, among them were, the CCA Beijing director Philip Tenari, the Al Ula director Ivana Blazvik. There was a glittering gala dinner in the Summer Palace of the city's north. And then there was an opening press conference attended by the president's daughter. But actually, the opening itself felt quite democratic and for the people. The biennial didn't actually have a VIP opening. It's entirely free, very well attended by the locals and, tourists, by which I mean people who didn't specifically fly to Bukhara for the opening of the biennial. As Diana mentioned already, speaking about the food, there is a festival atmosphere as well that she's sort of programming into there. Ibn Sina's cure for heartbreak involves also communion, the restoring of the soul by food. And so there is, I think, an attempt to weave that really directly into the biennial itself, while also catering for VIPs.
To what extent can we say already that the biennial's been a success? I mean, I don't know what constitutes success for this kind of new initiative. Do you sense that the Uzbek government is in this for the long run? Are we going to be talking about the latest edition of this biennial in 20 years' time,
I think that last question is really pertinent, and maybe I'll answer it at the end. I think, as you said, we have to sort of consider how we're defining success here, and also firstly acknowledging that the first edition of any biennial is always going to face a lot of logistical challenges, no matter where you host it. When you have a sort of very top-down approach, which, Uzbekistan being, a former autocracy, arguably still to some extent is. Yeah,
I mean, there's no official opposition. There are serious human rights issues still in the country, right?
Of course. And I don't want to start playing double standards. Even free democracies commit atrocities. Many are committing atrocities right now as we speak. However, I understand that in terms of getting sign-offs for things, everything can move extremely quickly. And then as soon as one person goes on holiday for a couple of weeks, there's a chokehold and there's a big block. So there are issues like this, but ultimately the exhibition opened on time and all the works were ready. So in that sense, I think you can consider it a success. And while I wouldn't say that this is the most boundary-pushing exhibition that a curator must travel to see to really understand the beating heart of contemporary art, it is certainly an amazing first step for art being shown in Uzbekistan and international artists to also come here. It's interesting, this has been branded by the government as the first major contemporary art biennial in Central Asia, but Uzbekistan already has an international biennial in Tashkent, and actually Gayana Imarova curated the 6th edition of it in 2011 or 2012. But the fact that I hadn't heard about it until I began researching for this podcast, and the fact that I'm sure you hadn't heard about it and most of our listeners hadn't either, tells you that Bukhara has done a pretty good job of placing Uzbekistan art on the global stage. And I think the choice of Bukhara itself is also extremely effective. I think it helps restore and propose Uzbekistan's very strong claim that it is a centre for art, because it has been for hundreds and thousands of years. It's been at the centre of art history for more than 1,000 years. Its culture absolutely needs to be studied if we're going to understand global art history. And I think this biennial has made a really strong case for that.
And so what about that longevity point? Do you think we're in this for the long haul?
So listen, I spoke to Gayana Imarova when I was in Bukhara, and obviously, she's incredibly tied to the government. She's not going to say anything but positive things. But one thing she told me I thought was really compelling about Mirziyoyev, which is that, I quote, he understands that Uzbekistan's main resource is people, and that's what he's investing into, his youth. Uzbekistan, as we are told constantly by the ACDF, is a very young country, and this push is to sort of give their youth also a cultural platform to work within, and I guess also to secure a sort of new dynamic national identity. And there seems to be a great deal of hope tied to the state funding of the arts here, which, quite frankly, really feels in certain contrast to many much richer, much more established countries that are currently cutting their arts funding. Things do feel incredibly nascent here. And obviously, this is a government biennial. I was on a government-sponsored trip, but there is a sense that the private sector in the arts is pretty much non-existent when it comes to contemporary art. And so the top-down nature of this project does make you question, I guess, to some extent, the longevity of it, because, if the government were to change, if its aims are to shift, would this biennial take place in a few editions? Perhaps not. But I mean, change doesn't happen overnight, and I think that this is an extremely ambitious first step towards fostering a strong domestic scene.
Well, Kabir, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Ben.
The Bukhara Biennial continues until the 20th of November. And now it's time for the Work of the Week. It's actually two works this week, Untitled from 2025 by Hurvin and West Indies from 2014 by Cara Walker. Both paintings are part of a new exhibition at the Michael Werner Gallery in London called Postures, Jean Rhys in the Modern World, which looks at the life and work of the Dominican-born writer Jean Rhys through the eyes of artists ranging from key modern figures like Francis Bicarbia to young contemporary artists like Samaya Critchlow. The exhibition is the latest in a series curated by the American critic Hilton, in which key writers are brought into conversation with artists. Previous shows have focused on Joan Didion and James Baldwin. Rhys was born in 1890 in Roseau, Dominica, and died in 1979 in Devon in the UK. She left the Caribbean aged 16 to come to live in England and only returned to Dominica for a brief visit after 30 years. That trip was hugely influential on her literary masterpiece, Wide Sargasso Sea, completed another 30 years later in 1966. It's now regarded as a post-colonial and feminist classic, a prequel to Charlotte Bronte's novel Jane Eyre that reimagines the story of Antoinette Cosway, the first wife of Mr. Rochester. In Rhys's novel, she is disparagingly renamed Bertha by her husband and effectively imprisoned in the attic of his ancestral home, Thornfield Hall, the situation in which we meet her in Bronte's story. I went to the Michael Werner Gallery to meet with Els and talk about Rhys and Anderson and Walker's paintings. Hilton, this is the latest in a number of exhibitions that you've created which relate to literary figures, to writers.
That's right.
I read somewhere, and I love this phrase, that it begins with a kind of dreaming.
Yeah.
Can you describe to me something about the dreaming in relation to Jean Rhys and how that manifests now in terms of an exhibition?
Well, one of the great things that happened recently was that I got an email from a former lover, and he had just received the invitation. And he said, "You have always loved her." It was someone that I knew many years ago. And I was so touched by that. So I think that the dreaming for me happens generally when I feel completely immersed in that writer's work. I become less myself and more their language. So that's what I think I mean by dreaming, when I can, it's not so much submit to the language, but be immersed in the language and become the rhythm and the locution of what the writer is saying. She lends herself to that aspect of reading. I don't think you can read her and be separate from this idea of language being a physical activity.
And therefore, language as a physical activity lends itself to creating a visual response in the form of an exhibition.
Exactly. I mean, one of the things that was very important to me was being evocative of what she had written as opposed to the literal transcription of it visually. Because she's such a visual writer, you can't really compete with that. What you can do is support her visualization of the world. And so that's what this show is about, is a kind of attempt to be evocative about Jean Rhys writing about the world.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a really good description, because it takes in so many different aspects of her writing and her life as well. And it seems to me that, you know, she's one of those figures in whom the work and the life are inextricably bound.
That's right.
Can you say something about to what extent that has influenced your thinking?
I think that if we can think of ourselves as a text, I think that she was the primary text of her life. The exhibition is divided into 3 parts, and each section of the show is about an aspect of her life. And I think that one of the things that she learned very early on in that kind of remote place where there was a very fraught history was how to observe. And I think on some very profound level, she couldn't have written about it had she stayed. I think that her exile, whether it was by choice or not, had everything to do with her ability to look at things. It's the great gift of being a writer, and it's also the pain of being a writer, which is that you're fundamentally outside of experience.
Yeah. So in a way, the evocation of Dominica and the wider region is based in a kind of yearning or a loss or a mourning?
I think that she's one of the loneliest writers that I've ever read, and I think that she's also one of the more lovesick writers. I think we all come from somewhere, and I think that she wasn't in a terrible hurry to leave that place, but I think that the shock of England and being dispossessed let her know what she had lost. And so Paradise Lost is a real thing, and it becomes bigger and bigger in your imagination when you leave it. I mean, that's the genesis of losing something, is that you want to return in some way or regenerate it in some way.
Absolutely. Before we come to talk about the works,
oh sure,
I wanted to just lastly touch on Derek Walcott because is it right that you discovered Jean Rhys through that extraordinary poem?
Isn't that
by
poem
Derek
amazing?
Yeah.
No, there were two reasons for my loving her. One was I was taken up as a teenager by older gay men, one of whom was a publisher, and he published schlock in order to have the budget to publish women that he really loved. Margaret Drabble was one person I'd never heard of before. I was a teenager, about 15. And then there was this woman, Jean Rhys. I remember what the book looked like, and it was Voyage in the Dark, and it was so shocking. And I knew that I didn't have enough life experience to understand entirely what she was writing about, but I had an enormous will to understand because of the incredible rhythm of her sentences and her storytelling. It was unlike any kind of narrative that I had read before. So then that was that. And then later when Derek's poem came out, I couldn't believe someone knew about her, first of all. And secondly, it was one of the greatest acts of empathy that I've ever read.
Yeah, and a wonderful, almost hallucinatory kind of quality to it, isn't it?
I mean, it's completely visual, and I never got over the line, Sundays, the furnace of boredom after church.
Yeah. It's beautiful. And then this lovely idea at the end of the poem that we imagine Rhys with Jane Eyre married to her right hand.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And that knowing that one day her wedding dress would be white paper. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the works that you've chosen to talk about.
Sure.
We could have chosen any. There's so much richness in this exhibition. But we're going to talk about Hurvin Anderson and Cara Walker. And I think this is a wonderful kind of double-handed way of addressing some of the subjects of the show. Let's talk about Hurvin first. This is a new work.
Yeah.
And it's really unbelievably evocative and powerful.
Yes. I think that one of the things that is so extraordinary about this picture, it's the one picture that was done in response to Jean's writing. Apparently his wife is a huge fan of White Sargasso Sea. And what he is able to capture here is the feverishness, not only of that place, but the ways in which bodies become capital. So the numbers, they're kept as in the ledger, but also it's something that Jean herself in White Sargasso Sea, there's the line where Antoinette is describing her mother's writing habit being kind of frayed. And she turns the lens and says, they know about these things. They know about money. Yeah. Always she's going back and forth between blackness and whiteness in the story. So those ledgers, what I understand is that they're bodies that were kept in ledgers. But I also think that it directly refers to the fact that Antoinette is a prisoner of economics.
Yeah.
And that one of the reasons that she marries is someone to take care of her.
Yeah.
So there's that. But then I think what's brilliant here is that the smoke from the destruction from the revolution that happens in the book becomes clouds. The way that the clouds are enormous in the Caribbean and almost sort of become a kind of overwhelming roof or shelter. And I think also that one of the things that he's captured in the back there is the volcanic aspect of the island and what makes a place, right?
Yes.
Some places are the Ice Age, some places are volcanic. He's able to get a lot of information in here, such as the snake that you see on upper left.
Yes.
The black snake on upper left of the canvas.
Yes.
And the flowers.
These hibiscus flowers.
Yeah.
But the wonderful thing about the hibiscus flowers is, of course, they're of the land and they relate to the greenness, the foliage. But it seems to me they're also like sparks from the fire. It seems to me that they're linking the building and the environment in which the building is set fire to.
Well, you can't, I mean, if you've spent any time in the West Indies, the vegetation and the topography is so profound. It lets you know that you're very small in relation to it. And I think that the ways in which the human scale gets reduced to humanness, it's very different than in a city which is built around the accommodation of human beings. The Caribbean is not built around our accommodation at all. It, in fact, is a landscape that can take over very easily and often does.
And of course, a building on fire is a wonderful link between both Wide Sargasso Sea and, of course, it's, if you like, source material in Jane Eyre. So you can see this as Thornfield Hall as well. You have this rider figure, which we can imagine might be Rochester and Jane and so on. And Hurvin is so good at this elasticity of time within this painting.
Absolutely. I think that that's a brilliant observation, that one of the things that he can do so extraordinarily well in his painting is to collapse time and to collapse scenes together. So that the cinema, let's call it the cinema of Hurvin Anderson, it's about the way that the fade would work in a film, where one image is overlapping the other, carrying you from scene to scene. I think he would be an extraordinary filmmaker as well.
Wow, yes, what a good point. Yeah, absolutely. Another thing about it, of course, is that you've referred to the environment of the Caribbean, and I think one thing that is really important in terms of Hurvin's work more generally is light.
Yes.
And a very particular light, which he has evoked in this extraordinary body of work, which he's been doing recently, which is all about buildings in the landscape.
That's right.
And the way that the building is a kind of, which we think of as monumental, are somehow dwarfed in that landscape.
Well, I think that his relationship to space is not separate from his relationship to time. In Hurvin's work, we're living in two different aspects of time. We're living in temporal time and we're living in psychological time. And so the temporal time goes on by minute by minute, but the psychological time kind of shifts focus, it changes, it drops out, and then it becomes linear, and then it collapses into something else. So I think that his relationship to space and time are not extricable, actually.
Right, absolutely. Let's talk about Kara. It's almost like an X-ray, I think, of Hurvin's painting, in the sense that his is dominated by green, of course, and then the flames. But Kara's is dominated by a colour that I think is something like dried blood.
Yes, I think that's a wonderful observation, that, again, the sort of violence that we see in Hurvin, we see the result of violence, but we don't see the bodies in action inciting it. And I think that Kara is very different in that she wants to show very definitively the ways in which the body reacts to and propagates violence. So she has, in this piece called The West Indies, this incredible relationship to not only slave ships bringing bodies over, but the production of sugar, which is where Jean's great-grandfather came to oversee a plantation.
And again, links directly to Wide Sargasso Sea.
Exactly. And so the relationship that we have there is much more related to capital than to Hurvin's. But Hurvin, too, is interested in capital with those numbers.
Yes.
The bodies, right? And Kara is interested in who are those bodies and what are they doing? The action that leads to violence, because sugar was the biggest export. There's a wonderful book called The Sugar Barons, actually, that I read. And it was so lawless, because all they had really were plantations, but no real way of taking care of servants and slaves. So the owners of the plantations were kind of lawless. And I think that is one of the things that Kara is trying always in her work to understand where history has taken us and why is it parallel to the history that we're living now.
And it was made, this work, in 2014, which was as she was gearing up for that extraordinary show called A Subtlety, which was in Brooklyn, which was the Sphinx made from sugar.
That's right.
The wonderful thing is you see the kernel of that figure at the right of the image,
That's
don't you?
right.
I mean, it's a horrific image in a way, because it is a figure being ridden by a kind of colonial gentleman, as it were.
And again, you have this sort of juxtaposition between the beauty of a place and the violence of a place. And I think that that's where she and Hurvin really intersect. How do you have this world that exists, that is so lushly beautiful, and at the same time, the cradle of so much destruction and capital-driven exploitation?
One of the things, of course, about both of these works is that they directly engage with a landscape tradition.
Absolutely.
And it's that wonderful...
Which you see a lot of in the lithographs that I put with them, but also downstairs someone like Celia Paul, who's the artist who did the Charlotte Bronte portrait over there. There are three things that really link all of the artists, which is they can all draw, which is a rare thing nowadays, and they all have some relationship to the ways in which figures or bodies live in the landscape. And I think that Hurvin and Kara, being exemplary technicians, because their technique is so grounded, they're able to let the imagination and the fact of history live in their work without fear.
And it's also tremendously important, it seems to me, that they are talking about landscape as a cultural space.
Oh my God, and who gets to be owned, right? Who gets to own it? So if Jean's great-grandfather is from Scotland, how does she end up there, right? And what is her point of view? And I think that part of her genius really was to say, they don't want me to identify. There are ways in which her Creole status protected her and made her incredibly vulnerable because she wasn't in the majority. I think that both of these works, how do the chosen few end up subjugating the majority? That's an amazing thing to think about, right? And I think that Hurvin, there's a figure down there on the bottom right of his painting, which really is very evocative of the beginning of White Sargasso Sea when the neighbor shoots his horse and drowns himself in the sea. I think that when the mother in White Sargasso Sea says marooned, right? There are ways in which the Creole class did feel themselves to be marooned from British Empire or wherever they were from.
And one thing I feel really strongly looking at both works is landscape as witness as well. The Cara Walker piece is dominated by these three upright trees, which are observing, if you like, the scene as well as the setting for it.
Well, it's funny. It's sort of like the eye of God in both of these pieces, right? So that we have Hurvin and we have that sky that rises above, and we have the vegetation that rises above that and dominates and becomes almost a kind of backdrop to the scene. And Kara's red becomes a kind of backdrop to the scene. And this is something that didn't occur to me until I was chatting with you. But when you look at a kind of Hitchcock film, when he pulls back from the scene suddenly so that you can see the chaos, but he does it very quietly. It has a very similar feeling in these two paintings, that kind of Hitchcockian stance, that the chaos that we have wrought needs to be looked at in a very calm way. So both of these artists, for all of the emotion and violence of the work, are looking at this very carefully, calmly, and again, this goes to their mastery. If they didn't have the technique, they would be much more involved in the emotion of the pictures. But because they're technically so brilliant, they're able to use the technique to bring us that Hitchcockian distance to chaos.
Hilton, thank you so much.
It was such a nice conversation. Thank you.
Postures, Jean Rhys in the Modern World, curated by Hilton Owls, is at Michael Werner in London from the 12th of September until the 22nd of November. And that's it for this episode. The podcast is produced by Alexander Morrison, Philippa Kelly and David Clack, and David's also the editor and sound designer. Our social editor is Kelly Foster, and our designer is Daniela Hathaway. Thanks to our guests, Madeleine, Kabir, Diana and Hilton. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads and Blue Sky. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye for now.
What do you love about being a dreams bed?
I love that my humans feel so comfy. Every snore is like a little thank you.
Oh, I like being supportive. Thanks to the bed experts in Sleep Match, their mattress finding machine. I'm perfect for them.
So many styles, and they pick me. I'm headboard over heels in love.
Oh, you big softie.
Dreams. Let us find you a bed that loves you back.
Here's the truth about AI. AI is only as powerful as the platform it's built into. ServiceNow puts AI to work for people across your business, removing friction and frustration for your employees, supercharging productivity for your developers, providing intelligent tools for your service agents to make customers happier. All built into a single platform you can use right now. That's why the world works with ServiceNow. Visit servicenow.com/UK/AI for people.
Hello, sweater weather. Bring on cozy duvet days, crisp air and crunchy leaves. Out is out. And the original pumpkin spice latte is in. Handcrafted with our signature espresso and seasonal pumpkin flavors. Then topped with whipped cream, cinnamon, and nutmeg. Hot or iced? PSL. It's here. Only at the Starbucks Coffee Company. Subject to availability while stocks last.
I'm Gemma Kearney, and I'm delighted to bring you a brand new series of Dream Space from Factory International, where we ask some of the leading creative thinkers of our time to guide us through their dream space, where there are no limits and anything can happen. We'll hear from Marina Abramovich, Max Porter, Nubia Garcia, and many more about how they use their imagination to dream up new realities. Subscribe now so that you never miss an episode, and dream on, dreamers.
If my call to the bank really was that important to them, why am I kept waiting and waiting and waiting? Banking shouldn't be this hard. Luckily, Handelsbanken is different. No chatbots, no pressing 9 for more options. Just real conversations with a relationship manager who knows you and understands your needs. Handelsbanken. Banking done differently since 1871. For personal banking, corporate banking and wealth management, search Handelsbanken.